My name is Linda Mitchell. I am an emerita member of the Emeritus College Board, and I have the pleasure of introducing Robert Davis to you. The reason why I'm up here and not Bonnie is because, first of all, I arranged the speaker, but the reason why I did was because Becky Davis is one of my beloved colleagues in the history department, and Robert is her husband. So she might be identified as the spouse of the speaker right now, but to my mind, Robert is the spouse of my beloved colleague, Becky. Becky is a historian of the civil rights era in the United States, and she has been an incredibly valuable, wonderful member of the history department for going on 10 years, is it now? 13, oh my gosh. Yeah, I remember her when she was a wet behind the ears kid. Who would come into my office and ask for chocolate.
You always had?
And I always had chocolate, because I was the person who always had snacks in her office. So the reason why I suggested Robert as our speaker today is because Robert is an historian who focuses on international relations in the 20th century, and whose work has taken him into avenues of research having to do with World War I that are very interesting but also very local. Robert was an undergrad at KU. He received his MA and Ph.D. at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, graduated in 2008, which is when I arrived at UMKC after 17 years at a previous institution, so he's a kid. And his area of specialty at the time was modern Europe with a secondary field in China, but his focus was on diplomacy, specifically NATO and the Cold War. But when he took a job at Leavenworth in the Command College at Fort Leavenworth, he changed his area of study to strategic communication and combat studies. And he is now an associate professor at of advanced military studies at the, I always forget, it's kind of an extended name, the Command
and General Staff College.
Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And he also, are you still an associate dean, or? Yes, and he's still the associate dean. So condolences to Robert for having to do double duty as a professor and an associate dean. And he, when we talk about this particular talk and the significance of World War I on Kansas City, we have the National World War I Museum here. There are very few World War I museums in the world. I've been to the Imperial War Museum in London, which has a very large exhibition of World War I stuff, because it was a very significant component in their history. And I think Kansas City and London are really the only two places that I know of that have honored World War I as an event that was world-changing in the way that most people think of World War II as world-changing. I think, as a longue-durée historian, because I'm a medievalist, I tend to think of wars as lasting a lot longer than just 4 years. So there are reasons to think about the 20th century as being one long war, and that starts in 1914. I can give you a little bit of fun facts about Robert. His great-great-uncle, Clinton Davis, Tag Davis, was a World War I veteran. Robert was born in Jefferson City, grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and so he's a local, and went through a rather complicated transition from being a diplomatic historian to becoming a military and U.S. historian. And his interest in World War I has a lot to do with the development of digital collections that are growing exponentially. As records, I don't know if you know about the way that archives develop records, but if records are under 100 years old, often they're restricted in terms of access. But once that 100-year date passes, then suddenly they open up. And this is one of the things that's happened with World War I studies, is that because that 100-year mark has passed, there are a lot more records available digitally, and there are a lot more opportunities to engage in research. I'm very excited to welcome Robert Davis to our podium, and the title of his talk is "The Heartland Goes to War, the 35th Infantry Division at the End of World War I."
At Fort Leavenworth, I would already be in trouble for mislabeling my slide. Thank you very much for having me tonight. It's very kind and generous of you to spend your evening with me. I will briefly say that everything I say tonight are my personal opinions and do not represent the United States government in any way, shape, or form, which is something that when you work for the federal government at Fort Leavenworth, you get to say a lot of conferences and talks. Tonight I'm going to highlight the role of the Kansas, Missouri 35th Division in the American Expeditionary Forces campaign in the Meuse Argonne. Probably should have been named the Argonne Meuse, as we read from left to right. The Argonne is a forest, and the Meuse is a river valley that the American Army would fight in from September, the 26th of September, 1918, until the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. So it is apropos that we gather here tonight on Veterans Day, or as the generation that fought the Great War would have called it, Armistice Day. On the right of this slide, you see a picture of Missouri native John Blackjack Pershing from Laclede, Missouri, an 1886 graduate of the United States Military Academy, who was tagged to command the American Expeditionary Force by President Woodrow Wilson. He's walking down the gangplank as he arrives in Paris in June 1917. He was the leading representative of an American Expeditionary Force that did not yet exist. When we went to war in April of 1917, the regular Army in officers and enlisted men numbered about 135,000. And the American National Guard units that were controlled by the states at that time numbered about another 180,000. In 1914, when war had broken out in Europe, we had the 18th largest military in the world. We were dwarfed considerably more by 1917 when we entered the war. The United States Army had not fought a large-scale war, as it was understood by European great powers, since the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Pershing is coming down the gangplank to raucous crowds in Paris, but on the left of the slide, you see that he is being greeted by two Germans. This is Crown Prince Wilhelm Hohenzollern of Germany and General Max von Gallwitz. They were not smiling when Pershing arrived, and Pershing would not be smiling when he met them. They would be the commanders of the two German armies to the east and to the northeast of the American Expeditionary Force in the Meuse Argonne Forest and the Meuse River Valley. And I will be talking a little bit about them. You won't see many Germans in the presentation tonight. They were somewhat race to the American Army. We didn't see them, but we certainly felt their sting. The picture on the right, which you can see displayed at the National World War I Museum here in Kansas City, is how the Army likes to remember the American Expeditionary Force. It is markers of all of the separate divisions and special organizations that were raised during the course of the war. Again, in April 1917, we didn't have a very large military, and the Army that we did have was largely concentrated, it's sort of interesting to say this in 2024, on the southern border of the United States, where we had been chasing Pancho Villa back and forth after his raid on Columbus, New Mexico. Pershing had made his name for his command of the field forces. He actually served under a Kansas general who passed away, Frederick Funston. Funston may have been tapped to be the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, but he had a heart attack and passed away, and so Wilson turned to his subordinate, John Pershing. The troops you see marching in to Paris right, a huge morale boost. President Wilson originally believed that we could send a single division of American soldiers, maybe 20 or 30,000 people, overseas, and this would be enough to buck up the Europeans' morale, the Allies' morale. The British and French thought it would be really handy if we'd send over a few million. There was a massive disconnect in April 1917 between what we were capable of doing, the army we would eventually raise, and the expectations of the British and the French. The British and the French were so desperate for manpower, the French government had suffered a number of mutinies in the French army in 1917, that they suggested that the Americans could send over a battalion of troops at a time, about 500 soldiers, and that they would put these 500 soldier packets inside existing British and French divisions. This was a non-starter for the American government, who felt that American soldiers had to serve under an American command. So then it became a race to see how long would it take us to build an army. The British government and the French government both sent over delegations to win us over, and the French were very clever. They sent over Marshal Joseph Joffre with a former French prime minister who nobody remembers, named René Viviani. The politicians were not very important here. The generals were. The British sent over a very obscure three-star British lieutenant general named Briggs, who no one, I think, remembers today, and no one knew then. But Marshal Joseph Joffre was world famous in 1917. He was the hero of the Marne who had stopped the German armies on their march toward Paris. And Joffre, who didn't speak much English at all, hit it off with American crowds. And after convincing the Wilson government that instead of sending over a battalion at a time, Joffre said, well, of course you'll want to raise your own divisions. Naturally you will. That's not what the French government wanted him to say, but he was a very clever military diplomat, and he knew that Americans were going to raise their own army. He said, raise your own divisions, send them to France. We will train and equip your divisions once they arrive. So if you want to understand why the Americans fought where they did in France in 1918, it's because Joseph Joffre and the French delegation beat out their British rivals. The British just assumed that we would speak English together, and therefore we would obviously want to serve alongside the British Army. But the British delegation, which was led by Arthur Balfour, a former conservative prime minister of Great Britain, did not have the popular touch that Joffre did. And once Joffre won the Americans' agreement through a memorandum of agreement to serve with the French army, he set out on a speaking tour all around the United States. And I did not put any pictures in, I apologize. But he traveled all over the central part of the country, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, St. Louis. And he was met by rapturous crowds. He was given the sword of the city rather than the key of the city everywhere he went. And it had an enormously successful public relations tour. There are two, I'm only going to tell half the story tonight as I try to move along quickly. There were two divisions in the American Expeditionary Force that were raised with Kansans and Missourians in it. The first division is the 35th Division, which still exists in the National Guard today. It was raised up from 2/3 Missouri, 1/3 Kansas National Guard units that already existed in 1917. The second division, the 89th Division, was raised from draftees and enlisted soldiers and entered the fight a little bit later. I'm not going to talk about the 89th today. The 35th is locally quite famous because there was a field artillery battalion commander that served in one of its field artillery regiments named Captain Harry Truman, who, as you all know, went on to serve as president. And then when you tour the Truman Presidential Library, there is a really excellent display of a French 75mm cannon and caisson system at the beginning of the museum, because again, Joffre had convinced us to send our men over quickly, organize his divisions to be equipped by the French. So Harry Truman actually fired his battery of 4 guns that he commanded, fired French 75mm cannons. So we will be talking about the 35th Kansas Missouri Division. There are Kansas Missouri divisions, so the Army sent them to Oklahoma. This is how the Army does everything. It's never really as logical as you would think it is. The Kansas and Missouri National Guard units were concentrated at what is today Fort Sill, Oklahoma, near Lawton, Oklahoma. This is a picture of the 110th Engineers, who were largely raised around Topeka, Kansas. Lawton, Oklahoma then, Lawton, Oklahoma now, large, broad, flat, treeless plain. Dysentery was a major problem for the trainees. Fresh water supplies was a major problem for the trainees. Many of the men spent a considerable amount of their time while they were in training in 1917 in quarantine. It was very difficult to actually get them organized and trained for shipment overseas. The 35th would arrive in England very briefly for a few days, and then Le Havre, France, in April of 1918. This is a map which I stole blatantly from the Truman Library. This is Harry Truman's journey. Harry Truman lands in France. He'll travel to an artillery training camp, and then, as you see, he'll make his way down to Pruth. Let's see how I do this quickly. There we go. In the southern sector of Alsace, the idea was to put the American units into sort of safe sectors of the Western Front to give them some experience in the trenches. Truman was an artilleryman, so he didn't have to go into the trenches exactly, but his unit deployed to the southern part of the Western Front that had been very quiet since 1914. It's not where the major fighting was. The infantry units from the 35th actually deployed north of the Somme battlefield of 1916 to go into training trenches with the British. So this was a very strange way from the point of view of Fort Leavenworth in the 21st century. You don't split your troops up, but that's exactly what we did. It was sort of who was available when. So Harry Truman and the artillerymen went down to Alsace, into the mountain country in the foothills of the Swiss Alps, and the infantry went up to northern France and the Belgian frontier. The man you see pictured here in several of these pictures is then Brigadier General Peter Traub. Traub was an artilleryman. He graduated from West Point in 1886. Not surprisingly, the same year as John Pershing. They were classmates, and many of the senior commanders that were chosen in the American Expeditionary Force had personal connections to the old regular army and the West Point Mafia that Pershing was a member of. Peter Traub in 1917 went to France with the 51st Field Artillery Brigade as a brigadier general. And he actually served in combat in 1917, which was rather exceptional. Only 4 American divisions fought in any capacity in France in 1917. Most of our army really wasn't there until 1918. But as I see here, you see the gentleman at the top right is a French general, and there's a French 3-star general sitting next to Brigadier General Traub. On the far left, Traub is being instructed by a French officer in the field, and on the right, he is addressing his men in the 51st Brigade after they have conducted their first successful raid of a German trench. This was considered the standard way you sort of brought people into line. You sent them to a quiet sector, you let them fire a few shells at the Germans. The Germans fired a few shells back at you. You didn't get too wild about it because you really want to get killed. Maybe raided a trench, they raided a trench. It was all sort of a polite form of introduction to warfare, which was very unlike what the Americans were going to experience in 1918. Traub would be chosen in the summer of 1918 to take command of the 35th Division. And this is a kind of a curious feature. Robert Farrell, who's written the standard book on the subject called Collapse at the New Sargonne, argues that one of the things that went very poorly for the Kansas-Missouri Division was they got a new commander just a few months before the offensive, and he came in and took a look at his subordinates and quickly relieved 2 brigade commanders and several regimental commanders days before this major offensive would begin. Farrell is extremely critical of Traub, and I think he makes an excellent argument. It doesn't make much sense to swap out all your senior folks days before you start an offensive. Okay, in 1918, the Germans thought that they were going to win the war. They had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against the United States in 1917. The thought was, we're going to starve the British before the Americans can get in the war. They worked out a peace settlement with the Soviet government of Soviet Union, well, not really the Soviet Union yet, but the Russian Soviet. And they were able to take troops from the Eastern Front and ship them rapidly to the west. And up in the northwest, on the sector right between the British Expeditionary Force, which is up on the coast, and the French Army, they launched a series of massive offensives in the spring of 1918. And once again, just like they had in 1914, it looked like they were driving on Paris. In these early March and April offensives by the Germans, several American divisions got thrown into combat. And you'll see these square markers with a double X over the top of them. That's how the U.S. Army always represents divisions. So, let's see if I can get this right. Right here, there's a little concentration of about 6 American divisions serving under a corps. They helped blunt this offensive to the southwest of Paris. So American divisions, by the spring of 1918, were going into line in an emergency sense to help stop the German offensive. And by the end of April, May, the German offensive had played out. The Germans didn't have enough manpower, even having defeated the Russians, to win the war. So the Allies began to think, perhaps it's now our opportunity to drive an exhausted German army out of France and back into Germany. In 1917, everyone had assumed that it was probably going to take till 1919 for the war to be won, for the war to be taken into German territory. In late 1918, some people got enthusiastic. So Pershing had been sent to Europe to do an American army in France. And so he was looking for a place, and again, because we had chosen to fight with the French, I might walk over here, it's just as easy if my thumbs are too thick for making this control here. I'll be right back. You see a little bulge right here sticking out of the line at St. Mihiel. That bulge, the St. Mihiel salient, was considered the prime location by Pershing to launch an assault on the German lines. The salient is exposed on 3 sides. So you can bring your forces to bear and surround them and pinch them off. So Pershing decided that the first place he would do is concentrate the American divisions he had, seal off this salient, and then he would be poised to drive into Germany. The American army, Pershing thought, would be the first of the Allied armies to drive into Germany. The British and French did not like this plan very well. The French government in particular was not really excited by anyone besides the French army driving into Germany first. Now the French were kind of exhausted, so that was a problem for the French. The Americans would launch this assault, and here the St. Mihiel salient is shown in a little bit closer detail up there at the top right. Pershing convinced the French government that this was the right first offensive for the American Expeditionary Force, and this offensive was launched in early September 1918. It was a multi-division assault on German positions. The Germans didn't have enough troops by this stage in 1918 to defend that long perimeter of the salient. They decided it would be better to fight a fighting withdrawal and to pull out. And Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force came away in mid-September with a quick victory. This is where they drove up to the northwest, and here they're poised to drive into Germany to the fortress town of Metz. And that's what Pershing wanted to do. But Pershing was part of an Allied coalition command. And his allies, as I have suggested, weren't real keen on the American army getting to Germany before anybody else. And there was also probably the problem, had Pershing even gotten his way, we would have gone from reducing a German salient poking into France to an American salient poking into Germany, which probably would have exposed the American army to be surrounded and cut off by the Germans. So Pershing's plan, while bold, was probably not very wise from a military point of view. In the summer of 1918, the Allies agreed that the only way to prosecute the war, and it's kind of amazing, that, the British and the French had been fighting side by side for 40 years, but it took until the summer of 1918 for them to agree to a single supreme commander. Dwight Eisenhower is very famous in World War II for being the supreme Allied commander of Europe. When we got to the Second World War, unfortunately, everyone knew that you had to hammer out command relationships at the very beginning. But in World War I, there were a lot of jealousies still at play, and the British and the French were not very good allies for many years. So it wasn't until the summer of 1918 that Marshal Ferdinand Foch was selected to serve as the Supreme Allied Commander. And what he told Pershing was, no, you're not going driving into Germany. I have a different plan for you. I need you to swing your American divisions at St. Mihiel north 50 miles and align yourselves between the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River and I need you to drive due north. All right, so this is how the American army ended up fighting where it fought, because Joseph Joffre had convinced us that the French were going to equip and train us. We've gone overseas, and then we found ourselves aligned. And what the French wanted us to do was participate in an overall Allied offensive where the British, the French, and the Americans would all launch concentric attacks on the German positions in northwest France to drive them out of France and ultimately clear Belgium. Our job, the American Expeditionary Forces job, was to drive north toward the town of Sedan. Sedan had a lot of poignant memory for the French. That's where Emperor Napoleon III, not Maximilian, Emperor Napoleon III and his army had been surrounded by the Germans in 1870, and Napoleon III had been captured by the German army. That had allowed the German Empire to be proclaimed, and Alsace and Lorraine, these two valuable provinces, had been stripped from France and given to Germany back in 1871. So now the French want us to drive on Sedan. It's historically important to the French, it's important for morale reasons, but most important of all is the military consideration. All the rail lines that kept the German armies in the field in northwest France supplied went through Sedan. All right, you can see to the northeast of Sedan, there's the Ardennes forest. That forest, which was also famous in World War II for the Battle of the Bulge, was a largely, at that time, impassable tract of rugged terrain and forest. So the idea here is to cut off the rail lines that are supplying the German army and trap millions of German troops, hopefully west of that line. Okay, afterwards, if anyone cares to look, I brought a map, which you see up there on the left of your screen. It's sitting here on the table on the left. This is a map from Sir Douglas Haig's headquarters on the 25th of September, 1918. And every little box you see on that map, and I know there's a lot of them, which look like ants probably from where you're all sitting, represents an Allied division or a German division. The German divisions are in black on the north side of the line. The yellow division, or the yellow divisions up in the north end, are the Belgian army, which was actually still in the field in 1918. Below them, you'll see the red boxes are the British Army. Think red coat, red army. Red coat, British Army. Fixing my Cold War stuff up. The French Army is in blue, and then the American Army. Here. Got that pink. Right, and again, kind of a blow up of the New Star Mountain. To the right. So the 35th Division, these Kansas and Missouri boys, had gone into a quiet sector of the line in early 1918. The infantry had been up to the north, the artillery had been down south. They are all brought back together in September of 1918, the first time really the divisions reconcentrated back together to serve as a reserve for the St. Mihiel offensive. They weren't used. So now they say, okay, you just have to march 50 miles to get in position for the next offensive. The New Sargon offensive, which started on the 26th of September, started 2 weeks after the St. Mihiel offensive began. Very little break between the two. So all these men from Kansas and Missouri, and this would have been true of a lot of the divisions too, they're camping in the woods. There are no modern facilities that these folks have available to them as we understand it today. They now commence a 50-mile movement, moving their entire division and all of its equipment. In order to conceal yourselves from the Germans, you tend to move at night. So it means a lot of night marches on small French country roads with lots and lots and lots of traffic. The French are moving east and west through this zone. The Americans are moving north and south. There are all kinds of gummed up roadblocks all the time. Men end up sleeping most nights off the side of the road in the grass or in the woods. Most of these soldiers who only had maybe, if we're very generous, 2 sets of clothes, especially underclothes, go a month without a bed. They go a month without a shower as they're moved from one holding position to the next. This is a very rough start to the New Sargon offensive for many of these divisions. The blue arrow represents the movement of the 35th Division in the south. up to its position for this offensive, right? This is a Fort Leavenworth thing. This is the enemy order of battle. You know, who were they going up against? They were going up against a number of German divisions. Mainly they're on the horizontal line toward the north center of the map. Originally, you can kind of see the black squares are concentrated on the eastern side of the edge. That's where the Saintly Hill offensive ended. So the Germans had fallen back from this American offensive. The sector to the north looked kind of quiet. There were really only about 5 German divisions between the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River. John Pershing would concentrate 15 American divisions against those 5 German divisions. And it's even more of a mismatch than it sounds, because the average American division of 1918 had 28,000 men in it, 16,000 rifles. Right? They were very large divisions. The U.S. Army decided after World War I that we should never do this again because they're really hard to move them. They're really hard for command and control purposes. They're way too big. They're way too hard to organize. You know, university of 30,000 people. We all know how much chaos that is. So this is 30,000 students on the move, right? We're talking about 18 and 19-year-olds camping in the woods. You're moving 30,000 students around. That's tough. They're going to go up against 5 very depleted German divisions. The Germans, of course, have been at war. None of their divisions are at full strength. A division maybe should have had 12 or 14,000 people in it for the Germans. A lot of times they're about half that strength. But the Germans have been at war for 4 years. They have become extraordinarily clever at the defense. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of what they did here in a minute. This is how the American Army was organized. Each of those markers here represents an American division of 30,000 people. Okay, organized into 3 corps, which is an Army organization above a division. The American 35th Division, commanded by Peter Traub, is the blue circle there. It's the Santa Fe wagon wheel up in the top center. It served under the 1st Corps under a man named Hunter Liggett, under the overall command of John Pershing, the U.S. First Army commander. To the right and to the left of the American Army were French armies. And this was not an American offensive alone, remember. This was part of a combined British, French, American offensive against the Germans. So this is a massive, incredible concentration. We didn't have this many divisions when we landed in Normandy at D-Day in 1944. Right? This is an incredible concentration of American forces. It's one of the largest military offensives the American government has ever undertaken anywhere at any time. And by the time it was over, several additional divisions who were not yet there would be committed to this fight, almost 2 million men in total, against a few tens of thousands of Germans. Okay, this gives you a little bit of a sense of the terrain. I looked at about 16,000 Google images, trying to find a good way to show the terrain of this part of France. You have the Argonne Forest on the left, and then the Meuse River Valley running from Verdun up towards Sedan, right through the center, cutting diagonally up this map. So on one side of you is a fast, swift-flowing river, the Meuse River, difficult to cross. The Germans control all the bridges, all the crossing points. On the left side of your offensive is an extraordinarily dense forest, old-growth European forest. If there's a woods in France in the 20th century, it's because you can't cut it down and farm it, right? It's nothing but stone underneath. The ground in this region is a mix of clay and stone in many places. It almost is a natural cement or concrete if you need to build dugouts and redoubts for artillery and machine guns. Very nasty terrain, hilly, rolling. Bob Farrell said, well, you know, Harry Truman probably would have appreciated this terrain as a boy from Grandview. That might be true if someone's not shooting at you. It is lovely terrain, but it's very hilly. There are a lot of small creeks that cut through this area, and anytime there's high ground in front of you, the Germans have sighted you in with machine guns that you can't see, and behind the hill, they have troops hidden that you can't see, and one hill range back from that, they have artillery that has you ranged in already. They know where you're coming. They've been in this sector since 1914. The Americans are brand new to it. 2 weeks before, they were 50 miles away. So the American divisions have to march through the night to get into position to fight in terrain they'd never seen before. Now, of course, there was aerial reconnaissance, there were photographs, there were maps provided by our French hosts, but you probably had a couple days of preparation to see what you were looking at here. And so you have to think about the individual 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are fit, they've done a lot of marching, but they now are going to be facing this rolling terrain cut with stone ridge tops, forest that's left of them, and lots of streams that need to be cut forward. Before the war, it was a pretty spot. This is the bluff above the Aire River at Vauquois. This is a French postcard from 1913, like a Michelin guide. Looks like a lovely place with some orchards on the hillside. Doesn't look too different than the bluffs up above the Missouri River, although our farm sits up on these handsome curves. This is what it looked like, that village, 1913. That village's location, 1917. The French and the Germans had fought over this terrain in 1914, in 1915, in 1916, and 1917. And what they kept doing was digging mines under one another's trench lines, and they would blow up the hillside in an attempt to destroy the other guy's trenches. So that is an aerial of Vauquois in 1917. And you can see the line of trenches on both sides. On the right side, the color photograph is an aerial of Vauquois from a couple years ago. It's on a French website. There's a memorial of Vauquois in the bottom center. That is what the earth there looks like today. Right? The rending of that place that occurred in the Great War still rends the earth there today. There is a modern village of Vauquois, but it's no longer on the top of the hill that no longer exists. The 35th Infantry Division had the good fortune of taking up position from the French lines on the south side of Vauquois Hill. And this hill ridge ran for about a mile of the 1.5 mile zone that they were assigned. So the first thing they faced was this bizarre moon-like crater system that the Germans are defending on the north side. You don't know how many Germans are there. The Germans had built very cleverly throughout this sector. I don't know if this looks like the Shire after Sauron got there. It's a little hard to make out, but this is Vauquois Hill on the north slope, and running along here is a path. There's a man on the right, and there's 3 men coming down a staircase up at the top right. This was a German dugout system built into the north slope of the hill that could hold an entire regiment of troops, maybe 1,200, 1,500 men, when it was fully secured. And it's on the north slope of the hill because when you fire your artillery from the south, you can't hit the north slope of the hill. You have to bring in a very heavy howitzer to get very close, to fire a very high trajectory to drop artillery in. So the Germans had built all the quarters for their troops on the north side of every slope. You can't see it from the south. They were extremely good at camouflage. Tough to make out. So you're facing this awful mass, and maybe there's 1,200 or 1,500 Germans on the far side of this, a few hundred yards from you, waiting for you to get out in the open to assume positions in machine gun nests. Tough spot. The Germans, again, they've been at war for 4 years. On the left, you see a steel stump that the Germans have constructed. Because many of the trees in the region were destroyed by artillery shell fire, the Germans built things to look like destroyed trees as observation posts. They also built underground shelters made out of steel, riveted together. Many of these were designed so that the troops would pass by them and they could tell their artillery where the troops were out in the open. So they wouldn't actually come out of these small redoubts, they'd actually use them to observe you as you passed them, to call in artillery fire on you. And they had buried their telephone lines underground for years ahead of time. And at the top right, you see a road stretching up in the top right corner. This was a typical German machine gun position. Anytime you saw high ground in front of you or to your right or to your left, you could count on there being multiple German machine gun positions set up at all of those places. Okay, so the American Army, like the French and the British, brought a lot of artillery to bear to try to destroy the German defenses ahead of time. And this assault was preceded by an overnight massive bombardment, not the longest of the war, that was conducted by the British on the Somme in 1916, but a long 12-hour preliminary artillery bombardment. Now, before Pershing opened up the assault here, he actually got the French 4th Army on his left to start firing first, and the American divisions that were 50 miles away at St. Mihiel to start firing first. And the thought was, well, we'll draw the Germans off. We'll make them think we're attacking somewhere else. And then starting about 10, 12 hours ahead of the assault, we opened up. The piece on the top is actually a stained glass window from where I work up at Fort Leavenworth. A lot of the classes donate a stained glass window to our building. It is of a caisson and team for a French 75mm cannon, because that was the main artillery that the American Army depended on. This was a French gun designed to win the War of 1871. They never wanted to be beat in the field by the German Army again, so they built this magnificent piece of horse-drawn artillery. It was supposed to be very mobile. It was supposed to be very effective against troops in the open field. The problem with the 75mm gun, which was the first piece of artillery in the world, for those of you who have technical backgrounds, to have pneumatic tubes to capture the recoil, so the gun caisson didn't jump up and down every time you fired it, which allowed the French gunners to get off about 6 to 10 shots a minute. It was an extremely effective piece of artillery, but it was not very good about hitting entrenchments. It was not very good at all, as it turned out, as the war went on against entrenchments. So the French gave us a lot of 75mm guns. Harry Truman commanded a battery of 4 of them. It would be good against Germans out in the open, but it was not very good at all against entrenched German positions. So then you got these crazy massive howitzers that you see in the center panel. And the United States Navy even put some 12-inch naval guns from battleships on railway cars and took them over to France, somewhat limited in their use, but extraordinarily destructive. So imagine you've just walked for 2 weeks, sleeping in the woods. Your clothes are wet and filthy. You haven't bathed in a month. And in the final 12 hours before you assault German positions, you're kept awake all night by this massive artillery bombardment. So you're not even going in fresh and rested. Must be time for coffee. This is one of the heavier guns. It's 155mm. This was a very effective howitzer compared to the 75. You'll notice here the Americans in this picture. This is the 130th Field Artillery, which is the Kansas Field Artillery Regiment, are wearing gas masks. There was a lot of gas exchanged in the Meuse-Argonne. It was fired by the Germans against us, but we also fired gas against German positions. And that is not always known today. I've taken students from Fort Leavenworth down there to the World War I Museum many times, and one of them said to me once, "I didn't know they used gas in the First World War." I said, "It's actually the most famous thing about the First World War." So one of the other things you had to do is keep your gas mask on at all times and be prepared to pull it on at a moment's notice if you happen to pass through one of these clouds or assaults where gas was involved. These are not these are not American or French guns. These are British guns actually to the north, but just to give you a sense, right, when the war began, everything was horse-drawn, but by 1918, the guns that really mattered were massive, heavy machines that were drawn by tractors with the firepower to destroy entrenchments. Of course, First World War also had tanks and planes. We didn't use either to very good effect in the Meuse-Argonne, but you may be interested to know that Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, later to become somewhat famous, commanded a provisional tank regiment in the Meuse-Argonne that actually supported the 35th Infantry Division. I will try to move ahead. So the intent here was to drive north to Sedan, but there were goals for each day of the fight. This is a picture of some of the open ground the American 35th had to move over in its first day. The first day of combat, that horrible hillside I showed you at Qua actually turned out to only be guarded by about 80 Germans. They were so run down by that stage in the war that their frontline defenses only had skeleton crews. So in the opening hours of this offensive, the 35th Division moved forward quite nicely, and all those red lines you see on the map are German defenses. And they moved through all of those up through the town of Varennes and Sheppey, and that blue line you see up the top is where all those young men in the 35th Division got about 10 to 12 hours into their first day. They stopped because to the north of them was another red line. And what the Germans were really good at doing at this stage in the war was putting little token forces forward, letting you walk until you were physically exhausted and worn down by their defenses, and keeping most of their troops in a reserve trench. So right when you ran out to the very end of your wherewithal for the day, you would find yourself under fire yet again and being counterattacked by superior German forces. Over the next couple of days, this is the 26th of September until the 30th, the 35th Infantry Division got increasingly confused and mixed up as it got into ever deeper and deeper into the layered German defenses. This was not uncommon. Many of the divisions to the left and the right of the 35th suffered similar fates, but the 35th Kansas-Missouri Division was declared combat non-effective by the 30th of September, only 5 days into this offensive. By that time, they'd suffered over 1,000 killed and 6,000 wounded to various degrees of severity. Some of them would go back into the force later. But 7,000 men combat ineffective out of a division that started with 28,000. So 25% combat ineffective in 5 days. And for those 16,000 riflemen who were actually the ones out in front of the artillery, that's really 7,000 out of 16,000. You're talking about over 1 in 3 of the infantrymen have been knocked out of action in 5 days of combat. We'll get through to. Pershing had preached a doctrine of open warfare. He said, we didn't send the American army abroad to sit in the trenches guarding France. Our job was to get out of the trenches and conduct open warfare and take the war to the Germans. So in many ways, the 35th Division and the other divisions they fought with in the Meuse-Argonne were carrying out what Pershing thought was their mission, which was to take the war to the Germans. But it came at a tremendous cost. These are some of the towns they passed through, Varennes on the left and Sheppey on the right. I will move ahead. The 35th Division got pulled out of line and replaced by the celebrated 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, which is out at Fort Riley today. So they were a green division that hadn't been in combat before. They were replaced by the most veteran U.S. division, the 1st. I find it interesting that the 1st Division, who had to fight through much of the same terrain the 35th had been in, suffered 8,000 casualties over the next 2 weeks. So was the 35th a green division? Yes. Did the 35th fall apart after 5 days of combat as a combat effective unit? By and large, they did. But even when they were replaced by a veteran division like the 1st, casualty rates remained much the same, 7,000, 8,000 casualties respectively. This was awful going. Awful, terrible going. The picture on the left is New York City on the 11th of November, 1918. The flags are out celebrating Armistice Day, which we are remembering here today together. The painting on the right, and I want to look at my notes so I make sure I say the name right place, by Dixie Selden. She was a regional artist in Cincinnati, and that's actually the return of the 147th Division, or regiment, which was part of the Ohio National Guard Division. But you see that the city of Cincinnati built an Arc de Triomphe model. The Rosedale Memorial Arch in Kansas City, Kansas is much the same. All over the country, arches of triumph were built to welcome the boys home. And these became a regular feature of the landscape, even if, albeit temporarily. The more haunting part, was the war dead. And this is a 1928 picture by the Kansas regional artist, John Stewart Curry. No relation to me, This is the return of Private Davis. And this was the homecoming, of course, for tens of thousands of Americans who were killed in St. Mihiel, the Meuse-Argonne, and some other places. As Linda suggested in her opening remarks, this is one that continues to haunt us. The shape of the world today, when you look at the very difficult and somewhat unsuccessful peace settlement of 1919 through 1923, we still live with many of the results of that period. We can talk about the Middle East, we can talk about communism in the 21st century. We can talk about having to go back to Europe, of course, for the Second World War. It was a difficult war. It left people asking a lot of questions why. And as we look back on it 110 years hence, I think we still have many questions left open to us. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Sir.
Yeah, one thing that is very striking is the war is over in November 11th, but any of the dates that you're talking about where there was intense fighting were September, October, August. It seemed like things had to change very fast. You might repeat that.
Yes, the many of the dates I'm talking about are September through November 1918, and the war ends with an armistice on the 11th of November. So the question is, why does it change so fast? Most of the generals had thought that the war would continue into 1919, and they thought it would be necessary to drive into Germany, to drive home defeat to the Germans. The German government, of course, collapses. The Kaiser flees Germany and goes into exile in Holland, where he will live till 1940. If Hitler had been a good old-fashioned conservative, surely he would have brought the Kaiser back. But the German government, a socialist government, is formed, a temporary provisional government. They know they can't carry the war on, and to have the war brought home to Germany seems like a worse choice than acceding to an armistice, even though they find the armistice terms very onerous when they are eventually announced. But the German army was crumbling rapidly, and the German senior leadership, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, didn't think Germany could fight any longer. They thought they were better off to get an armistice while the German army still controlled some French and Belgian territory, and they kind of thought in the moment that they might use that as a bargaining chip. Didn't work out that way because of the rapidity with which the German army fell apart. But that was the sense. Armistice now, we have some negotiating room rather than fight into 1919 and definitely lose this war. Sir?
Yeah, I was just curious how the casualty rates compared for the British and French for that last offensive that you described.
It's an excellent question. The American casualty rates were a little bit higher. I do not have the statistics, but from a comparative point of view, they were a little higher. The French and the British had warned the Americans that the American divisions were too large and too densely concentrated. And Pershing sort of thought, well, if I shove this many men together, we can use this mass of humanity to drive the Germans out of here. The British and French had tried that on the Somme and at Verdun and the Nivelle offensive. They knew that masses of humanity could not, in fact, win against machine guns and artillery and barbed wire. So they'd kind of given up on those tactics. We, in some ways, were using, we were a year or two behind our allies, despite the fact that they tried to train us. We just hadn't heard them necessarily. And one of the things we would do is we would never build divisions this heavy again. It was just too densely concentrated, in a sense, targets for the German defenders. Historians always get in trouble when they don't have statistics with them. Sir?
To what extent, if any, mutiny may be too strong a word, but were there disciplinary problems given the casualty rate that they were experiencing?
The American Army didn't have a lot of, certainly nothing like a mutiny yet. The French had suffered a mutiny in 1917 in a number of their divisions. And it's sort of a qualified mutiny. The men didn't quit fighting. They just said they weren't going on the offensive anymore. They said, we're going to sit it out and wait for the Americans to get in. There were a lot of stragglers in the Meuse-Argonne, and there are a number of Army studies after the war that tried to sort out, well, did these men get lost, or were they making their way back to rear lines? When the offensive opened the morning of the 26th of September, a heavy fog blanketed this entire region, and the fog didn't lift until between 10 and 10:30 in the morning. So a number of people did get lost, I think, legitimately, but there was also a serious straggler problem as far as higher headquarters was concerned in the American Army in Meuse-Argonne. Well, thank you very kindly for having me tonight. It was a nice visit.